Hello and welcome to the latest episode of News from the Gelding. My name is John Chapman and I'm the author of a fantasy novel that's due to be released soon by the name of James of Galandar. Now, what I would normally do is talk about what I've done in the previous week, but last week I was scuppered by a week of headaches. And this week I realised I had various things in the way that would prevent me from recording on Friday. So I've decided to record on Monday. It's Monday today. In Britain, today is a bank holiday, a national holiday. So it's very quiet outside, which is nice. So this week, the main thing that's in the way is a taxi license test that I've got to take on Thursday. Now, as I said last week, I was a taxi driver for 2 years, so I held a license. But the way things work, the way the local council works is if you don't renew the license straight away, you lose it, and if you want another one, you've got to take another test, which is very annoying. My driving ability hasn't declined, and they're well aware of that fact, but they want some more money. So I've got to do that. I really don't like driving tests. I can drive perfectly well. I'm not about to drive off a cliff or anything like that. But as soon as someone sat beside me with a clipboard, I become very nervous. So I'm just worried about making, silly little minor mistakes. But hopefully that goes to plan. If not, I'll lose the job I've secured and I'll have to think again. So wish me luck. It's already happened, but anyway, oh dear. So instead I thought I would talk a bit more about the book and elaborate on something that I mentioned before, and that's about the forests of the Gelding and the indigenous people that populate it, the Gelders. When I initially had the idea for this book, I knew that James would visit a forest, a giant forest, and there would therefore be a race of people that lived there. As I said before, you run the risk of, if you have a race of people living in a forest, they are automatically assumed to be elves. So what I'm going to talk about now will hopefully distance that idea, because they're nothing like elves. So it's a giant forest, but it's a forest that's been in decline. The forest has been there for thousands of years, and the Gelders have lived there for thousands of years. So it's an ancient race. So I had to think about lots of different things to paint my picture of these people. What I would come to do is draw on a few different races that exist or have existed in our own world. I haven't done lots of research into this, but I've used Native American Indian and the indigenous Aborigines of Australia as part of that inspiration, but for the larger part, Japanese culture. I'll go on to explain in more detail how that came, what aspects I took to inform the Gelders. But before that, I want to address a few other points about these people. So firstly, they are not religious in any way, but they venerate the forest. They respect it and they care for it. They're custodians. They have zero impact on their environment. Essentially, they're vegan, so they don't hunt and they don't kill animals to eat them. Rather, they live in perfect symbiosis with their environment. They scavenge for like berries and things like that, but the larger part of their food is acquired in a way that I haven't explained in the books, but in a way it's kind of, I suppose, like farming, but different. They give and they get back in return. That's very vague at the moment. The books don't expressly describe this process. One of the problems with writing a story is that to crowbar information in sometimes just doesn't work. You need to keep the story going. Occasionally you can put information in, but sometimes to put in too much, it just doesn't work. But the most important thing is that they respect their environment. Another example of this is that they do light fires, they do cook, but the firewood, they don't chop down trees. They burn seed pods, which they don't consider to be alive in the same way as something growing from the ground. So those can be burned. If there's a tree that's diseased, certain people are permitted to remove limbs, which can then be used to burn as firewood. Their clothes, tools, their weapons, they're all made from a substance which I call willowing, which is it's like willow, the wood willow, like a coppiced willow, and it's not magic, but they can form objects once the willow branches have been severed in a special way, and create objects that are essentially still alive. So nothing they create is essentially dead. So to create a sword, the swords are essentially wooden, but they use something called a blunt blade. It's the only object made from metal that they use, but it's a blade that's essentially blunt. It's as blunt as a spoon, but for some mysterious reason, is when they put the blade to the willowing, it slices through it like it's butter. So there's a kind of a pact between these people and the forest that the only blade they'll take to its wood is the blunt blade. But in so doing, it retains the life. That severed branch doesn't die. So when a sword is no longer used, for example, it can be plunged into the ground and it becomes a sapling. It will grow into another tree. I mean, there's a lot of detail about this in the books, but that's a very simple explanation of how they are able to live in perfect symbiosis. So, some other little additions to the social structure of the Gelders is that they are roughly all equal. Men and women are equal. they grow up from an early age using weapons. So by the time they reach adulthood, they're as good as each other in combat. So essentially there's no difference between them. There are communities, they live in villages, fairly small. There aren't cities or anything like that, with one exception, but I won't talk about that now. And other people live in a kind of nomadic sense. So it's a fairly interesting mix. There are also big, the larger communities are often known as houses with a capital H, and these are presided over by a lord, the head of a house. But essentially that's the only hierarchy within that structure. Everyone beneath the level of lord is more or less the same, but they have different abilities and different functions within the society, but they're all roughly on the same level. I could go into loads of detail about this, but if you're I can't give too much away because there's no point in reading it, I suppose. So anyway, I'll go back to those initial inspirations or what do you call it? Reference points that I drew from to paint my picture of these people. One moment, please. Sorry. Oh, it's gone a bit cold. So, like I said, when I talked about Native American Indian and the indigenous islanders, the Aborigines, I didn't research it thoroughly or anything like that. I took what I knew of these societies and kind of took what I needed. So from these two, it was about the economy of living, not necessarily coveting objects, not having loads of possessions, because to what I understood of these communities, they would be largely nomadic and wouldn't want to carry loads of things around with them. They also had and have a very intense respect for the environment in which they live. And there's also the aspects of like bushcraft and understanding the environment and what it can give them, those kind of things. Tracking animals, being able to navigate a forest. Obviously, if you've lived in a forest all your life, it's not a maze like it would be to an outsider. There are ways of navigating. So there's that side. But then in a more rounded sense, I took Japanese culture as the basis upon which I formed the Gelders. Again, I didn't research like feudal Japanese history or anything like that. I took what I knew from the time when I lived there. As I mentioned last week, I did a bicycle ride across Japan when I was 24. Prior to that, I lived there for a year in a rural village in the mountains of Okayama, a very remote village by Japanese standards, and so what I experienced there, I ended up feeding into my my conception of this race that lives in a forest. In a very what do you call it? In a superficial sense, I imagine the Gelders to resemble Japanese people. They are fairly pale skinned because they're living under the trees all the time. They're not in direct sunlight. They have long black hair. The men wear their hair long and loose, and the women wear their hair braided in special ways that become known to the reader later on. There's a reason for that. There's the Shinto religion of the Japanese, similar in some ways to paganism, in which the natural environment is worshipped. So that was also an interesting parallel. There was also the rules and the etiquette that the Japanese ascribe to bathing and eating, and even their language. These systems I've always been very interested in, and I've used that as well into some of the practices and rituals that the Gelders live by. And I suppose the other thing that was interesting was the way James is treated by the Gelders as an outsider. Now this was something that I experienced myself, living in a remote village where I was the only Westerner for miles around. It was a very strange experience. Some people would react to my presence with nothing short of awe. So, I don't know, an alien had landed in front of them. I'd have people pointing at me from across the street, or just staring. It was very, very strange. But mostly respectful. I used to get a little bit self-conscious of being stared at so much, but it's understandable. Some people could be less, a little rude sometimes, but not really knowingly. I never had anyone be nasty or anything, but they didn't always know that I could understand what they were talking about, and they'd be talking about me in certain ways that wouldn't really be acceptable. So there was, then I could use some of that for James's position being in another culture, one that was totally different from anything that we have in, well, not, as I've said, not totally different, but very, very different from what he's used to. There's something else I was going to say about I suppose, yeah, the idea of being an outsider. So James, he has trouble. He is a major outsider. He shouldn't really be there, and there are people there that don't want him there. And I know from people like Westerners that have lived in Japan for decades, and they're always considered outsiders. So there was also that, not in a racist way, but that they're separate. They'll never be Japanese, even though they speak the language fluently and they've lived there longer than native speakers, perhaps. It was strange. I was only there for a year, but the way I lived immersed within that that rural setting. By the end of it, I almost felt, it's absurd to say really, I suppose, but I felt Japanese. But it was strange. I would look at like a news, there was something about, I think it was the American elections. This was long, a long time, it was 2001 or 2, I can't remember now. There was something going on, and I saw lots of Caucasians on the news, and I thought, my God, they look, I'm not making this up, I thought they all look very similar, and they've got very big noses, and I thought, crikey, that's the way I look. Because I think if you spend every day surrounded by another culture, another race, eventually you start feeling as though you belong, you're part of that. Anyway, that's kind of an aside really, but I thought that was an interesting, it's given me an insight into what another culture could be in a fantasy world, in a level that's not, just a superficial way a race would look, say, in a fantasy world. I've tried to give it depth and a history and strange folklore and things that will come to light later on. So there we are. I probably won't go on too much. I've been rambling again. I know that. I'm sorry. So I'll stop there. Right. So I'll say goodbye now. If all goes well, I'll see you next Friday, and I'll record it on Friday as I did last time, and I should have the release date for the book by then. So if you have any interest in what I've been talking about and would like to read the book eventually, then perhaps subscribe if you wish, or follow me on Instagram. There's details down there, and I'll leave it there for now. Yeah, see you soon. Cheerio.